Yeah, so I'll be talking about the mechanics of political and social change in a democracy. So, how does change actually happen? What forces are at play, and what can we do as citizens to effect such change? And by political and social change, I mean change that was effected, for example, by the civil rights movement or the feminist movement, or the civil rights, or the environment movement. So I don't mean change that happens on the local government level, so say like, for like better public transport or, things like that. Okay, so I'm going to start first with a little bit of history about how democracies were set up. So we can ask the question, what was the aim of the founders of modern democracy? And so just to pick a point, if we go back to 1640, say, so to the English Civil War. So if you look at the textbooks, the usual stories that, you had the Civil War, conflict between, on the one hand, all the supporters of the king, and on the other hand, the supporters of the parliament. So, supporters of some kind of form of democratic rule. But that's misleading, actually, because if you look at the details, the war was actually forced into elite groups fighting for control of the country. So the two sides of the war, you had, on the one hand, you had the landowners and merchant class who were aligned with the parliament, and then on the other hand, you had, pretty much the wealthy white men who supported the king. So there was like the two sides of the Civil War, and if you notice, the people weren't involved in that. But why the war happened? It didn't come out of nowhere. So the Civil War happened. It erupted at the height of popular mass movements that were beginning to challenge all aspects of English society at the time. So they were challenging, like the economic model and the slave master relationship and things like that. And so these two elite groups I was talking about, the one who supported the king and the one who supported the parliament, they had to make some kind of challenge or reaction to this mass agitation in the population. So these two elite groups were, quite scared of the population, and they were scared that it was going to get out of control. So as one historian put it at the time, these elites were worried that the people were becoming so curious and so arrogant that they will never find humility enough to submit to a civil rule, which basically means they were scared of the people. So like, and just to repeat, so the English Civil War wasn't fought between the people and the king, so like they weren't trying to get some kind of parliament and they were fighting the king. It was actually a war between the parliament, which was a bunch of elite white men, and the king. So that's, just an example of how, a modern democracy was set up. And then, again, if you look at the textbooks, just to pick one of the random, it says, like the Magna Carta or the American Revolution, the English Civil War concerned fundamental questions of sovereignty and political rights that are still the guiding principles of democracies today. And in a way, that's kind of right. So the guiding principles of democracies since the inception of the English Civil War was just pretty much a power play between two elite groups fighting for the control of the country, for the control of the general population. And you might think this sounds like conspiracy theory, but many people, high-level figures have pointed this out. So, for example, for example, we have James Madison, the so-called father of the American Constitution, and he remarked, and he wasn't joking, that the primary function of government is to protect the minority of the opulent against the majority. So another example is Jon Jay, who some of you might know. So he's one of the founding fathers of the United States and the first Chief Justice. And he insisted, many times that the people who own the country ought to govern it. And he wasn't joking either. And then, okay, so when the US was established in the 18th century, its founders feared, in the same way as the people in the UK feared at the time, a century earlier, that the majority of the population were getting, out of control. And as Madison put it, he was scared that the general population would secretly sigh for more equal distribution of life's blessings. And he feared, and they all feared at the time, that the population would demand land reform and basic rights which we all take for granted. If you actually look at the documents, say, of the Constitutional Convention, you see that the participants are talking about how to stop the poor majority from demanding such rights. And so what ended up happening was they met and set up a system to prevent the population from having control over their own lives. So they set up what they call a formal democracy, which shouldn't be. They set up a formal democracy which wasn't a functioning democracy. So, as one historian put it, the American Constitution was basically a document designed to check the democratic tendencies of the period and to ensure that the better sort of people were in power. And what they meant was what they called the more capable set of men, i.e. the wealthy white men. So, in effect, what the American Constitution was set up to do was to prevent and actively exclude most of the population from having any kind of say and involvement in the government. So just a bit of history. So those are the, guiding principles of democracies from the time they were set up until today. And our own system is a mix of, I'm sure you all know, it's a mix of the English system and the American system. So now we can ask, so what does this leave the general population? How are they involved in the political process? How do they affect change? And so clearly, I don't have to tell you this, significant and lasting political change has happened since the 17th and 18th century. Significant political change has happened in the last 40 years, even in the last 5 years. So even, say, before the 60s and the 70s, we had no environmental movement, no feminist movement, no third world solidarity movement. So the world is much more civilized than even back in the 1980s. So how did all this happen if what I just said about the way democracies were set up and how they function, if that's correct? So the answer is we made those changes. On the population, the general population at the time made these changes, not the people in Parliament. So the population forced the government to make laws and action that's in favour of the people and not in the interest of the elite, which are, sit in government. And this point isn't, you won't see this often discussed because we're not used to talking about, politics in class terms, but because, everywhere in the media or, in the literature, it's always assumed that everyone in society has the same interest, what's called the national interest or a strong economy or whatever, but that's not the case. We don't all have the same interest, and crucially, the people in power who happen to be in government or in the business sector or wherever, people who, as Jon Jay said, who own and govern the country, their interests are not the same interest as the general population. So just as an example, we have some like Purdon was scathing of all official persons for whom the people is always a monster to be fought, muzzled and chained down. And we have Kropotkin, who was always angry at Parliament, who regarded people as a horde of savages who would be useless as soon as government ceased to function. And we have Emma Goldman, who joked that, if voting changed anything, they'd make it illegal. And, that's true in a way. But of course, to validate, claims like I just made, like, you gotta look at the evidence, of course. And I think if you look at the evidence, it's clear if you look beyond the official histories and dig a little bit deeper. And there are a few books, if you're interested, who look at this in details. For example, the famous A People's History of the United States by Howard Zinn looked at this in detail, and just to plug my own book, there's The People's History of Australia, which I've been working on for a while, and we'll be working on for even longer while. Okay, so I'm just going to end now by giving two case studies which show what I've been talking about isn't crazy. So I'm going to give a historical example and a modern day example. So the historical example I want to give is about the New Deal in the US in the 1930s. So Franklin Roosevelt was the president at the time. Just as a funny joke, this is based on him. He's a Muppet. But no, here's him being offered a cake. Okay, so about the New Deal. Say the New York Times, for example, it says of the New Deal that it ushered in the American welfare state. And we finally just talk of FDR's simple-hearted idealism. And apparently, at least according to the New York Times, plain people, whoever they are, had the conviction at the time that FDR had given them head and heart and would not cease fighting in their cause. So there's like a mountain of literature about FDR, how he was the leader of the nation in tough times, and the usual cliches. But if you actually look at the details and dig a little bit deeper, you'll see that the New Deal programs, they weren't the result of FDR's simple-hearted idealism or his passion for the welfare of the population. New Deal policies were actually, as FDR himself admitted, they were forced upon him by the population. So in the 1930s, the US was like out of control. There was a powerful movement of citizens which were demonstrating. They were calling for a different economic model, because I'm sure the economic model at the time devastated the country. And it was quite, violent at the time, and there were many demonstrations. And just to give you a sense of how, active it was. So in 1937, there were 4,740 strikes lasting an average of 20 days each, and they had, general strikes which, shut down the country for days, and no mail, no milk, no food, and in comparison, in 2007 there were 21 strikes in the United States. So in the 1930s, the US was out of control, and the population was organized and ignoring what the government was trying to do. And what happened was FDR brought in all the New Deal policies in part to undercut, and pretty much what the population was pushing for. And there's a high level plan was admitted at the time. The future of capitalism was at stake. So, just for example, as Naomi Klein puts it, workers' protections, pensions, public health care, and state support for the poor citizens in North America in the New Deal policies, they all go up with the same pragmatic need to make major concessions in the face of a powerful left. So the population forced the government's hand in a way. And FDR, he didn't bring in the policies out of the kindness of his heart. He was forced to do it. by the general population. Okay, so I'm going to give lastly one more example, which is a modern day example, which many of you must have been in. So it's the example is the mass demonstration against the invasion of Iraq in 2002 and 2003. It's not often mentioned, but the Iraq War was the first war in history in which mass demonstrations took place before the war even began. So that was the first time in history when that happened. So, for example, in just February 15th, 2003, there was a coordinated day of protests in 600 cities. 30 million people worldwide demonstrated, and it was probably like the largest single coordinated protest in history. And then the usual question that you always get when someone goes to demonstrations, like, what did it achieve? Did it stop the war? Well, it didn't, but that's not the right question to ask. So the question that we need to look at is, what did the demonstration do? So if you look at the mainstream media or even publications on the left, the overwhelming answer is that the protests were ignored and they failed. But that's not the case. So if you actually look, so the protests didn't stop the war, but they did severely limit what the invaders were able to do in the war. And the Australian government and the American government, if you look at declassified and leaked documents, they were paying close attention to what the domestic population was doing, and they aimed, the war aims in relation to that. So, so a government can only do what is politically possible, of course. So, what its citizens will allow it to do. So if there was no opposition to the war, the Iraq War would have been much worse. And it continues to be bad enough, but it would have been a lot worse if people like us didn't and demonstrate in the streets and do all the kind of activism which we wanted to do. So just as a quick example, and this all comes from like leaked documents and declassified documents. So the US couldn't use the same tactics in Iraq that it could use in previous decades, even in Central America in the 80s. So there was no saturation bombing, no chemical warfare on the same scale as Vietnam or Central America, and the US had to allow elections in Iraq, which it clearly didn't want to do. And all this was due to mass protests and domestic opposition to the war in many sections of society. And like I said, high-level planners in Australia and the American government in the UK, and they all say this. Okay, so just to finish off, so how does political and social change happen then? Who are the real agents of change? So the cynics, might say it's like this, or the slightly less cynical but comical might think it's like this. But no, so like the way change actually happens is, it's us, the population, who affects change, not the politicians and government. So change comes out of the organized community of committed people working for change for a long time, and every person has the faculty to take control of their own society. And of course, the idea is not to overthrow governments and start again. The idea is to take them over and force them to work in favor of the people. And in saying that, of course, political and social change can't be decreed or organized from above. It's got to be developed by continuous mass actions. And in time, as each person does their part and does their best given their own circumstances, change will come, as the saying goes, like a thief in the night. And I'll just leave you with this quote, and thank you.